directory, and it's
Oh, really?
yeah, it's a whole thing. But I can open it from my phone. It's hard to see from here. The banging helps.
Oh, so you go to tap the screen and go to the directory.
Yeah.
And then find your name.
Yeah. I think I'm in it. I'm not positive. Why is this?
Last time I looked, Rabbi Solish,
He's still there? I wonder if that goes to my phone. Morning, Stanley. Yeah, cool. Excellent. Okay.
I wasn't laughing at you. I took a picture. I have two small dogs. As I say, one of them big rat. Both ran under the table. I was fast enough to get a picture.
Well, the thing that recorded, did you see it? Did you see that recorded?
I took pictures. Not a video.
No, very cute.
I was like, yes, I would have that. Now, tell me they don't understand. Oh,
There's a twin.
They know exactly what you
You
say.
know who it is?
When I was a kid, we had a poodle.
Does it share the same name?
Used to take
No.
to this place called Happy Haven Pet Motel to be,
Maybe you can.
shaved and everything. All we had to do was say Happy Haven Pet Motel.
That's what happened to say that. We're down.
So if they understand.
They know what I'm talking
Oh,
about.
yeah.
No.
They know.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
For sure. How was your weekend?
Weekend was great. So far, so good. That was good. I passed by yesterday. It was busy yesterday.
Mhm.
Yeah,
During the
so-
day?
Mhm, yeah,
Yeah.
last night.
Yeah.
That was what day was that again?
Oh, last night?
Last night, yes.
Friday night, you mean?
Friday, yes, Friday.
Friday night,
Yes, Friday.
yeah, it was a whole thing going on.
Yeah.
The young adults program had a, oops,
Fine. He was there with my old. Very busy.
I gotta keep an eye on the door. Yeah, they made a whole big dinner here Friday night. Morning.
My time. Yeah.
Do we need more copies?
Um,
Might need more copies. Let me, there's a couple right here.
Hey, Mo.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
I guess.
He's coming too?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay, cool.
Thought I would.
I'm gonna send some more off to the printer right now and I'll grab them in a minute. Let's see here. Might as well print the whole thing, right? Hey. Let's hope three's enough.
I told you I won't.
Somebody's trying to get in.
Yeah.
It's fighting back.
Morning. Okay. You know, no, I'm not sure where they are. Yeah, they were, I was looking there before, I didn't see them. There's usually like a caddy somewhere. That one's a fridge, so it's not that one. There's usually like a caddy somewhere. Maybe you found them. Yeah, so there's one right here. And I just sent a couple off to be printed. So, most of, maybe I could send you to go grab them in a minute. It's probably locked, but I could do. Okay. It's not gonna be ready yet. It's going real slow. I'll let you know. All right. Okay. So, we're gonna get started. And I have some more packets, printing. That should be ready in a minute for anybody who doesn't have. So we will briefly recap what we looked at last week. We got deep in the weeds on a lot of analogies, right? A lot of metaphors. Exploring this juxtaposition of expression, of gilui, of revelation, and concealment, and the relationship between the two. And trying to understand this concept that we have, this tradition around Shem Havaya, the name of God that is 4 letters, that Yud Ke Vav Ke, right, that we pronounce Adonai, that is connected with revelation, and then the opposite of that being Elikim, which is connected with concealment, and these sort of divine processes seeming to be opposite. Paper, it's not a print, it's not a paper. Okay. Does everybody have between sharing and everything? Is it's all good? We're making it work? Okay. I'll print some out for next time. So we've been going back and forth on this deal, and we sort of spent all this time up until now really sort of bolstering and like defining our question. So on page 116, we began, or even before that, where does the question really conclude? Oh, I think it's yeah. So on 118, we really sort of concluded the question and began to sort of look at the answer. And the last thing that we spoke about, the last metaphor that we gave, or analogy that we gave, was the relationship between a teacher and a student. And that's something that we're going to go really deep in, really far in, to sort of break down each nuance in that analogy to understand better how it applies to not too deep. We don't want the Kabbalah class to get too Kabbalistic. So if we remember, what we said was that we have the sort of the standard, the basic understanding that we're working with is that these two names represent two opposite forces. And then we've had to justify that with this principle that the Zohar tells us that they're all one. And that's how we're sort of navigating this deal and trying to figure out how it could be that you have equal and opposite forces that are also equal, right? That are the same, that are one. So that's where we're at. On the bottom of page 118, we began to sort of summarize it to say that Kech Hagbola is, where does he say? Kech Hagbola hu gam kein mikech hamaskel atzmei. No, where did there's a different, maybe the previous page, where we said that Gilui is a You need a copy?
Please.
So
Figure out them.
I think Mo's going to get some.
Sure, just. Put 118.
Did you, yeah,
All right, in there?
it's, it didn't, did you get in there?
No.
Okay, so here, take this. You have to wave it by the thing. And then the printer's on the right when you walk in. So we said that the last thing that we left off saying was about how Gilui, revelation, expression is concealment, and concealment is revelation, and they are in some sense one and the same, right? Or they sort of they both contain each other, right? And that was we were looking at the student teacher metaphor to express that to reveal information, to share information requires a concealment, requires to withhold some information simultaneously, right? So like we spoke about speech and the relationship that speech has and how it expresses thought, that while it expresses and shares thought, it also conceals the thoughts, and that those can exist simultaneously and be sort of one and the same expression. So we're going to go much more in the weeds. And we'll pick up on page 125. And we're going to introduce a quote from a book called the Vayada'ata Kodesh. They have a nice little blurb about the Vayada'ata Kodesh on the top of page 125, that he was a Spanish Kabbalist. How'd it go? It didn't staple? That must be because it didn't finish. Okay. Well, it'll be good enough, I think, for now. Okay. Get it all sorted out for next time. So the Vayada'ata Kodesh is a Spanish Kabbalist who introduces this idea that really sort of broadens our perspective on what it means to talk about God and God being infinite, which is to say that we use a word like infinite, and when we really get down, when we really look past the sort of superficiality of what the word means, native to language is limitation. And that to describe something as infinite, or to understand something as infinite, being that we are in a physical world where we like operate in a sense of dichotomy, so infinite precludes finitude. And saying that about God, that he's infinite and not finite, would obviously then limit him. So the Vayada'ata Kodesh presents this idea that both infinite and finite are expressions and are potentialities by God's essence, or for God's essence. And that with that in mind, we can sort of conceive of the names Havaya and Elikim, these sort of divine processes, we can sort of conceive them as both being expressions, even though they're doing opposite things. So that's what we're going to introduce today. So on page 125, the names of Havaya and Elikim, these two names that represent the divine capacity for expression and the divine capacity for constraint or concealment, both are sourced in God's essence. The infinite light, or Ein Sof in the language of Kabbalah, Atzmus Mahus, the essence and the essential isness, the essential existence of the divine, of God Almighty. The that just like God can express himself, he can reveal himself, and that is a capacity that is sourced in his essence. Because we know that, like in the sun analogy, that the light contains all the same elements of the luminary. The light expresses the luminary, which or contains the same rules and the same traits as the luminary. So in this sense, just like the luminary is infinite, so too the light would be infinite. Whereas we might have thought previously that Havaya is representing something more essential to God's nature, something more essential to how we understand God, and then Elikim comes as a sort of afterthought or as a second stage to conceal after the revelation. So it's rather that there is this static essential being or essential reality that is God's essence. And in that, in the expression of that, there is the expression that is revelation, which is Havaya, and there's the expression that is concealment, which is Elikim. And that both of them are limited, finite expressions of this infinite source. So how do we get there? How do we get there? Is through understanding this teaching from the Avodas HaKodesh. So what does it say? The Ar Ensaf, the second paragraph on page 125. Ar Ensaf hu shleimusa dekela. The Ar Ensaf, God's essence, is total perfection. Total shleimusa dekela means the wholeness of everything. Right? There's no lacking, there's no limitation, there's no it's totally perfect. And it's totally singular. And just like it contains a capacity to be infinite, right, which is how we typically conceive of God, we have to say that he has a finite potential too. Right? If we said that God was only infinite and not finite, we would be limiting God in some way. Or at least that there's a potentiality for it. You would detract from its perfection if we said that there was only one without the other. So just like he contains an infinite potential, so too there's a finite potential, which means that both of these we can't ultimately say anything about God's essence other than that there's God's essence, right? It's beyond our capacity, the limitations of our language, but we can say that in the way that it manifests, there's a capacity to manifest as infinite or to operate as infinite, and there's a potentiality for it to operate as finite. And both of those have to be there to keep intact God's wholeness, the essential wholeness of his essence.
Is one of the junior part? It's on the side.
So what we're going to say ultimately is no. That's the sort of, I think that the assumption that we're working under is that naturally we would think that revelation is more natural, more important, more primary, and that concealment comes as a secondary thing or as a response to the revelation, right? But ultimately we're saying, if the Zohar is saying that they're all one, what we're going to try to get to is a place where we say that they both work in tandem and they're both equally important and they're both equally expressive of his essence.
That's part of why you're using the word radical. Maybe it's different.
I mean, it is radical. That's why I like to emphasize it, because Chassidus is really radical. It's so yeah, I think it's important to recognize how out of the box it is and emphasize that it's not just that it doesn't just come in this. It's taking thousands of years of tradition and texts but it is elevating them to a more sophisticated level that requires us to think much more deeply and much more profoundly about our relationship with God.
It's not really a tug of war, it's actually just the balance.
Yeah. That's what we're trying to get to. We'll see if it certainly says it in the mimer. We'll see if we can wrap our heads around it. Okay, so we have this concept of the shleimus of the wholeness, that God's essence is whole, and within that there are these potentialities that are both infinite and finite. So let's continue, page 127. Like he says, here, this gray box, the top of 127, having redefined Hashem's concealment as a core element of his revelation, and that they both work seamlessly together towards one common goal, we can now conclude that they're two sides of the same coin, right? Therefore, Havaya, revelation, and Elikim, concealment, are truly one. So let's see what he says in the Maimon. So therefore, we have our Ein Sof, we have God's essence, we have Elikim is the way it manifests through concealment, the way it represents concealment, the way there is a capacity for concealment. But that means that Elikim is just as an essential expression of God's essence as Shem Havaya is, as the name of Havaya is, which means that both these names and both of these capacities are equal in their essentiality expression, right? There's a lot of like the same terms, essence and existence and expression, and we start to get lost in the alliteration of it. So at that point, we can understand that they're not fighting each other and they don't contradict each other, but they work in tandem and they work to sort of facilitate this perfect expression, this perfect balance. Because we have a principle that we're going to give a number of examples for, that we have a principle that essence can't conceal essence. What does that mean? That one thing can't conceal itself. So the first example we give is a person can't conceal himself with his own body, right? When you play with a kid and you cover your face with your hands, they're like, "Where'd you go?" Right? And it's funny because you're still sitting right there. They just can't see your face. But so we have a person can't conceal himself. How do we know that? So one of the ways we know that is because it says in Shulchan Aruch, it says in the code of Jewish law, right? We wear a yarmulke on top of our heads, and it says in Shulchan Aruch that you can't use your hand as a yarmulke, right? You can't cover yourself with your own hand. Now, he adds in the parentheses, but if you put your hand on your friend's head, that would count, because you're two separate people. Because an essence can't cover itself, so therefore, in the same sense, Havaya and Elikim are sort of like two hands or two parts of one body in some sense, not to get overly physical or corporal when we're talking about corporeal, when we're talking about God. But the same applies, that the essential expression that is Elikim can't cover over, can't conceal the expression that is Havaya. One is not reacting to the other, because it can't work that way. It can't be responsive. It can't be reactive one to the other. Since they're both expressions of, they both are essential expressions sourced in God's essence, and they don't oppose each other, because even though one conceals and one reveals, and we consider those to be opposite expressions, they're not doing that to each other. They're doing it in tandem and they are expressing, they are different modalities in expression. So whereas there can be an expression that takes the form of gilui, of revelation, there can be an expression that takes the form of concealment, of elikim. And both of those are sort of like lie on the same spectrum of God's essence relating to a zulas, relating to an other, which is how we get to, this physical world. So that's the first part of the mimer. This is sort of section one, and now we're going to dismantle this nice house of cards that we've built. So let's go deeper. Hashpas Aimek, the next page 133. Hashpas Aimek Aseichol Talmud Al Yidei Shemalamed Esei Tchila Rak Chetzenius. So if we remember, one of the metaphors one of the analogies that we gave, that we looked at, was this relationship between the student and the teacher, and how we said one of the first concepts that we introduced was this idea that to share information has to be concealed, that part of the interaction process is the concealment, and that when we conceal, it allows for the externality, the superficiality to be shared, to be revealed, right? Like we said, the soul's essence is limitless and boundless and singular and undefinable, and that when the soul is concealed and the most superficial external parts of the soul enclose themselves within the body, that facilitates our eye to see and our feet to walk, right? The soul expressing itself through the body is ultimately a concealment that then allows for the most external parts, the most insignificant parts of someone, the most unsophisticated parts, to then express themselves through our body, which tells us how deep and sophisticated and aligned our soul must be, right? We said that to share, to have dialogue, to share through speaking, we have to take the intensity of our thought and we have to enclose it and really sort of strip away a lot of it to allow only the most external part of that thought to be put into words, right? The confines of language create that you can't share the essence of the thought, you can't share the intensity of the thought. We have to strip all of that away in order to put it in a word that then can be shared through language, through conversation, through dialogue, right? Words have meaning and they have connotation, but they don't capture the same intensity, the same fullness and robustness of the thought that the thought does when we're in the middle of thinking it, right? That's a much more profound experience. So when it comes to teaching, we said that we introduced this concept that the relationship between the teacher and the student is that the teacher has to withhold the majority of his understanding and the majority of the information in order to convey a foundational understanding, right? To give over a basic grasp, and then to build that foundation that they can be built on further, right? We were saying how for Einstein to teach a 3-year-old, he would have to start with arithmetic, right? He would have to withhold everything that he knows in, super advanced math and physics, and restrain that and contain that and conceal it to give over the rules of simple arithmetic. So we're gonna delve into this this entire analogy on a much deeper level. So let's understand this further. So we're saying we've done all this back and forth to say how they work in tandem and how they're both expressions of one essence, and essence can conceal essence. But at the end of the day, we're still saying that Shem Elikim, the name of Elikim, is concealment, and Havaya is revelation. So it's nice that we've set up this whole system where we say that they're not affecting each other, and it's not a linear response or any type of reaction, but they both work simultaneously. But still, at the end of the day, what one is doing is opposite to the other. And it would seem that to conceal, you have to conceal something that has already been revealed. There would seem to be some linear subsequence in that relationship. So, how do we understand? It seems that in some way we're saying that it's not even concealing, but we know that it's concealing. We're saying that it conceals, but it doesn't conceal. Right? We've sort of backed ourselves into this corner. So let's look at this. We're going to look at it from a different vantage point. Continuing on page 135. So the first analogy that we're going to give is to look at the relationship in the way our intellect works, in the way intellectual processes function. Is there somebody trying to get in? Or is-
No,
We have 135.
we've gone,
Oh, you're out of the pages?
only went up to 127.
Oh, gosh.
Oh, this was all just one thing. Was it just like?
Uh,
Right there.
This is awkward.
It might be alphabetical or. Oh, it's not good. I'm gonna see if I can find it.
Let's,
What website did you find this on?
this I printed out. I could send everybody the PDF if you want to look at it on your phones. Fred notwithstanding.
Really?
Let's see. It is on,
Copy if anyone wants.
it's there's one copy if everybody wants to share. This is.
God has many other names too.
God has many other
So
names.
each one represents a different.
Yeah,
It depends on what library you're learning.
each, that's true too. Each one represents a different, is connected with a different sphere. I think in some sense, the dichotomy of revelation and concealment is sort of the umbrella for all of it, right? And we see that even though, so we have a tradition that there's 7 names that are the holiest names, right? Those are the names that aren't erased, right? So within those names, so there's 7 non-intellectual spheres, right? There's the 3 intellect Chabad, and then there are the subsequent 7. So each one of those names is connected with one of those. And all of those sort of can be mapped out to either a concealment deal or a revelation. Okay. I don't know what the best way to do this is right now.
I can understand you pretty well, this following was.
Okay, so everybody will just listen along and yeah, right? It's like a real throwback. Okay. So we have this idea of the mashpia and the makabel. K'may chacham gadol shetzarich lashpia seichel u'makabel. Makabel cotton. I think there's a mistake here. It's a good thing you don't even have the page. The makabel cotton shalei be'erech hamashpia. So like when 2 people are engaged in learning, are engaged in a conversation, one is learning from another, and the distance, the intellectual stature between the 2 of them are significantly different. There's an ocean between the two of them, right? So the teacher is trying to convey something to the student, and the teacher is, some serious academic, and the student is 5, right? So that interaction requires a lot of nuance, a lot of juggling, a lot of gymnastics to successfully convey a concept between the two of them. In Bechach Shamashpi, Yitamtem V'Yalam Etzem Sichle V'Chachmose Shesh Ba'adav Ramus Golahu Legal Lerak Masha Be'erke. So the teacher has to engage in intense concealment. The teacher has to conceal the overwhelming majority of not only his generally everything he knows, but even just pertinent to the conversation and the subject matter at hand, he has to conceal the majority of what he's trying to share. So because if he were to transmit, if he were to share, if he were to express too much of the information in this one topic, it would overwhelm the student. It would become an experience that was confusing because there would be too much coming at it. So instead, the most effective way to transmit this concept would be to only share the most superficial and the most external parts of this concept, in order that the student can sort of take it in bite-sized pieces and begin to integrate it within his own intellect. Bekitzer nimrat lefi ercha makabel, in a concentrated way, recognizing and being tailor-made to the vessels, to the capacity of the student, right? It can't be a one-size-fits-all deal, but it rather has to be with the student in mind, understanding where the student is holding, that the teacher can effectively transmit even the opening conversation, right? The initial concept, to have that conversation. And even further, typically what's useful to be employed is analogies. That the nature of an analogy is that it is totally foreign to the subject matter, right? It's totally disconnected and totally unrelated to the subject matter itself. And so the analogy contains within it, but in some ways conceals the entire matter, the entire subject matter within something else entirely, like clothes. That like clothes, which allow us to present ourselves in certain ways, right? Clothes express outwards certain things about us, right? A fireman looks like somebody, he indicates to us that he'll, take cats out of trees because of his uniform, right? There's nothing about the person himself that reflects that or expresses that. It's only his clothes that indicate that to us. But his clothes are something that are totally separate from him, right? He takes those clothes off at the end of the day when he leaves the firehouse. But it is, so in that sense, the mashal, the analogy, functions in a similar way as being something totally disconnected, totally independent, not even necessarily relevant to the subject matter itself. But at the same time, because it's sort of distant and because it's so different, it can allow, and maybe more accessible in some ways, it can allow for that beginning of the understanding, the beginning of the transmission to take place in a way where there can be some effective communication and some effective information sharing. So the analogy is distinct, is separate, is sometimes in some ways foreign to the concept. And it's, I don't think it's accidental that we are having an analogous conversation about analogies, right? Right, we're using this idea of a teacher and a student and all the intricacies that are involved in the way the teacher conveys information to the student to understand a little bit better the relationship of God expressing himself to us, right? So we're going in the weeds about analogies, but the analogies help us understand the analogy, right? But the analogy serves that through it, the more we can understand it, right? So the relationship between a student and a teacher is something that we've all experienced, and we've all been on probably both sides of that coin, on both sides of that relationship. So it's something that we can wrap our head around. It's totally foreign, ultimately, to the way God interacts with the way God provides and expresses vitality and existence to a zoolos, to another, to something separate, something distinct. But because it speaks to our own human experience in a way that's much closer to how we understand it, to how we conceive, so then we can go very deep into the analogy, and it'll help facilitate a little more understanding, a little more nuanced understanding in the way these names, Havai and Elikim, express God's essence. That just like, for example, when we talk about clothes are tailor-made to fit the body, right? They fit the person, right? So there has to be intentionality, and there has to be deliberate focus or deliberate intention in how we construct these analogies and how they help us understand the nimshal, the analog, right? And so therefore, the more tailor-made and the more dialed in and focused the analogy is, the more it can help us to understand the analog, to understand the original concept, right? There's a lot of sort of poor, like half-baked analogies that we could give for something like this. But to focus on the idea of the student and the Talmud, the student and the teacher, is specifically because it's the most effective and the closest to this concept of Havai and Elikim. If there were a more effective analogy, we would use that one instead. But the fact that we're focusing on this one is because it's the closest, it's the most tailor-made to express what is going on, what the interplay between Havai and Elikim is. You have a question?
Well, I said it was back to the farming. Outside the uniform, you know who you really is.
Right.
You see a part of it, that's outside the uniform. But as you paint the picture and as you put the uniform on slow by slow, you see that he's actually professional as a farmer.
Right.
So as when fold a code, you see better.
Right. Because it gives more definition. So it helps us to understand better. It makes the picture clearer.
So we're now, the picture's being painted, to move the painting, move it every stroke of the brush. We painting to paint the picture, then remove it again.
Yeah.
Then we'll do it.
Yeah. Yes.
So we're going to facility.
Yeah. So we have a number of ideas that express this further. And the first one that the Rebbe Rashab shares is the idea of the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is the first written form that the oral tradition takes, right? We have this tradition that when Moses went to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, he received the 5 books of Moses, the Torah scroll that we have today, and with that, alongside it, the entire oral tradition, right? If you open up the Torah, it is essentially not understandable. It refers to all these things that make it clear that it's assuming some type of prior or like separate knowledge of something that exists alongside of it. For example, when it tells you that that there's a mitzvah to put on tefillin, right? So it doesn't even refer, the word tefillin doesn't exist anywhere in the Torah, right? Tefillin is an Aramaic word. It doesn't say anything about, it says that you should tie them to your hand and and it should be a word the word that's used is totafos, which is a word that's entirely untranslatable, and some opinions think is not even of Hebrew origin. And it says that it should be a totafos between your eyes, right? So it tells us nothing about anything. And it's only with the oral tradition that we know that tefillin are black leather boxes that are square, that have straps on them, and that throughout history, since the earliest times, and certainly since the earliest archaeological digs that we have, tefillin have looked the same. They've been square and they've been black and they've been made out of leather, right? But it doesn't say that anywhere. Nobody ever wrote that down. So that's an example of this oral tradition that was given alongside the written tradition, alongside the written Torah. So every mitzvah in the Torah, it will say something about it. It will sort of give us an idea, but it by itself does not convey what the actual mitzvah is, right? There are some that are more explicit, right? It says on Passover to eat matzah, right? So we know what matzah is, so that makes it a little easier. But on Sukkot, right, we take the lulav, right, the lulav and the esrog, and we take 4 species, and the Torah is super vague about what the 4 species are, right? And so it's only through the oral tradition that we know what it means, what the 4 species actually are, and the ways in which we bring them together. So the Mishnah is, so that oral tradition, that oral Torah was given to Moses on Mount Sinai alongside the written Torah, but the tradition was, and the principle was, that it was not to be written down. It was specifically meant to be oral, and the way in which it was transmitted was entirely oral. So it was all a student-teacher relationship, and there were academies and there were different yeshivas set up to transmit that and to teach that, and it was all taught in the name of the one who said it. It was all based on this tradition of, you had your teacher and everything that you got from your teacher, who got it from his teacher. And that was an unbreakable chain that went back to Moses. After the destruction of the first temple, so Rabbi Yehuda Nasi decided that it was time to write it down, because too much was getting lost. There was too much confusion, and there was too much, it was a trying time for the Jewish people. And so it needed to be written down. And it was a big deal that he wrote it down. And he wrote it down. What he wrote down is called the Mishnah. He basically compiled every teaching of every rabbi who had every tradition, and the conversations that they would have. And he wrote it in the most terse, pithy way possible. That it's all totally shorthand, and it's all almost like bullet points. It's like Mo as our resident Mishnah expert, but it's like super shorthand. And so what we often talk about is the Talmud, right? So the Talmud is the Mishnah and then the Gemara. So the Gemara is the conversation of the later generations of rabbis, the next generation of rabbis, their students. So they would have conversations trying to understand the Mishnah. And so you'll have one line of Mishnah, like seriously, like 6 words of the Mishnah, and the Gemara will go on for 8, 10, 20 pages trying to understand those 6 words. And that's because the way in which Rebbe wrote the Mishnah was that it was so precise and with such deliberate rules and intentionality that, or intention, it was able to, you could extrapolate from 4 words all these different teachings and all these different logics or trains of thought or schools of thought and understandings that could be fleshed out over pages and pages that would allow for all this conversation to take place. So in this idea, we're saying that this was like a big aside, so I sort of lost where we were going. So the analogy has to be tailor-made. It has to be made with intention and with deliberate focus to express the analog. But the closer or the more focused it is, the more it's able to contain of the original concept. So in that same sense, when we look at something like the Mishnah, even though it's using very few words, it's not a classic metaphor or analogy in that sense, but it is containing a lot of information in very few words because of how deliberately it uses language and because of the system that Rebbe developed in how the Mishnah communicates a concept. So when you know the rules of the ways in which the Mishnah works, so then when you see a line of Mishnah, there are questions that jump out to you automatically because there's normal ways, there's sort of established ways that things are expressed. So if they don't follow that pattern, then you automatically know that it's trying to convey something else to you. Do you have a question? Oh, okay. And this is what it means that a person should always teach his students in a concise form. This was a sort of an ethos with which the Mishnah was written, that it happens to also be a teaching of the Mishnah, but it is the sort of the rule by which the Mishnah plays, which is the Mishnah prizes brevity. And so our focus on brevity is not that we should just eliminate or eradicate the majority of the concept, but it's that to find the most effective way to express it is to use the fewest words, but to use the most effective words, to use the most aligned words that express the majority, the most of the concept as possible. Not to reveal the depth and the breadth of the concept, right? To expand it out too far, right? We were talking about this last week, that if you take an analogy and you start to apply it, or a understanding, a train of logic, and you start to apply it too far and extend it too wide, then it loses its focus and it can lose its meaning. It can even lose its application, right? So we don't focus off the bat with depth and with breadth, but rather because those aren't within the wheelhouse of the student, but rather to find a form of brevity, a concise form, Paul hapnimius. So rather not to express all of the intricacies of a concept, but rather to only give over the sort of the external part of it in what is most concise that the student can engage with, right? Like when we talk about something like the curtains, right? That there are these spiritual concepts of curtains that separate between worlds. So we could go into all of the Kabbalah behind the curtains and why there's such a concept as curtains and the different nature of the different curtains and all of what Kabbalah talks about of them having different colors or being of different materials, different weaves, right? but functionally to talk about them merely as that there is some sort of conception of there being a separation from world to world, from realm to realm, really serves our focus and our conversation much better, right? It doesn't help to go into the weeds on something like that because it's too Kabbalistic for the Kabbalah class, right? So when we use this concept of analogy, it's all focusing on what is most effective to be transmitted, what's most effective to be shared. בדרך קצרה אין הכוונה שלו יהיה בזה פנימיוס ועצמוס שכלי, ואם כן אין זה דרך קצרה כי אם כמי שכל אחר. But the fact that at the same time, we're not saying that it means that the essence of the concept or the most intricate, nuanced part of the concept should be withheld or should be avoided, right? Because at that point, if we just ignore them, then that means that we're just conveying something else. We're no longer married to that concept, right? If we're talking about the curtains and then we just start talking about the nature of distinction and we lose sight of the curtains entirely, so then we're not talking about curtains anymore. We're not talking about that Kabbalistic concept. We've left the conversation for something else. So the art of teaching and of conveying in this way is learning how to be able to share the concept in its concise form in a way that it can still be accessible, that the student doing the homework, thinking about it on their own, can reflect on this concept and find further depth and further nuance in his own mind. Which means that there is this sort of the way that the Rebbe Rashab conceives of it is that there is this sort of the seichel itself. There is the intellectual concept itself, and that concept needs to be transmitted. And the ways in which we're transmitting this concept is all the different ways that we're covering certain parts over, concealing certain parts, revealing certain parts, constructing a different methodologies for how to transmit it. But ultimately, there is this essential concept that is the focus of what we're trying to transmit teacher to student. So, but the essence of the concept has to be hidden within these external things, or maybe even these foreign things, to ultimately make it accessible, to ultimately figure out a way that the student and the teacher can meet in the middle, and there can be a transmission there. There's another mistake. Right, so like the Mishnah was ultimately, these rabbis knew they knew the whole Torah backwards and forwards, and they knew the entire oral tradition backwards and forwards, right? Everything was memorization by them. They knew it in the deepest, most intense ways. And Rebbe, when he wrote the Mishnah, distilled it all into these like little, 2-3 sentence paragraphs that contain mountains of Jewish wisdom and Jewish thought. Right? The first Mishnah asks, when can you say the Shema at night? And then presents 3 opinions. But then the Gemara has a field day with trying to understand what those 3 opinions are. The whole Mishnah is 4 sentences? The first Mishnah, 5 sentences maybe? And the Gemara goes on and on to try to take apart each idea and each train of thought that each rabbi presents, that these dissenting opinions, to try to understand what time you can say the Shema till at night, right? So Rebbe took this entire corpus of rabbinical wisdom that was in the ways of conversation and the ways of these ideas being shared, and distilled it down to these few sentences. But within these few sentences, the art of what he did and the beauty of what he did, the real mastery of what he did, was to be able to contain within it all the depth, and that depth wasn't lost. It was just concentrated to such a degree that it could be expressed in a few sentences. You got a question?
Yeah, just a comment, just starting the Mishnah with that particular Masechta, there's a whole reason why that starts with that. And like the first letter even too, there's
Right.
like, the first letter of the Mishnah is Me'emasai, which means from when. You could have just said Me'emasai, like when.
Right.
But like there's like a whole reason for that. Like I heard it's because Torah ends with a lamed, the next letter in the alphabet is mem. So like show continuation, like so everything's super nuanced,
Mm.
like we were saying.
Right, like in most tractates, when you look at when you open a Talmud, in most tractates, or at least in a lot of tractates, one of the first questions that they ask is, why is this one coming after the one we just finished? Like, why is this order even relevant? Right, so like in Sota, for example, like there's like a series of 3-4 tractates that are all sort of related. They're sort of connected in the Torah, but they're all fundamentally unrelated, but they all come in a linear sequence. So one of the first questions to Tom was like, why is this the order? What does this have to? And this order was all set up by Rebbe. It was all part of how the Mishnah was constructed and how it was written. So all of this is to say that the most effective analogies and the most effective pedagogy is the most deliberate and also the most focused and the most concise. Just to conclude, Amram be'emes yesh b'lashon ha'mishnah kol emek v'recha pnimius v'atzmos chachmasim. So the fact of the matter is that while the language of the Mishnah is very concise and seems to be accessible to even novice students, right? We start teaching Mishnah to kids at 6, 7, 8 years old. So it is accessible to even people without any type of serious background. Doesn't require to know the entire history or the entire corpus of Jewish wisdom. You can learn one Mishnah and it stands alone and it's understandable and engageable by itself. At the same time, each Mishnah contains within it the entire depth and the nuance and the significance of the essential concept that it is conveying. And we see this, that the Gemara will be pages and pages afterwards just to understand a few words from each line in the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is Bahalam, it is concealed, right? Where the Gemara, where the Talmud reveals it, it's all concealed within the language of the Mishnah in its brevity, in its conciseness. So let's just wrap up here. There's another line or two. So too, when it comes to the way that the teacher gives over to the student, that it is for the teacher can still sense the entire concept present in how it is being transmitted to the student, but it is concealed in a way that the student only sees as much as is relevant for his experience or his understanding. Which we would call the superficial or the external part of the concept, the way it's being given over. And this entire capacity that the teacher has to conceal his intellect, to constrain it in a way that makes it accessible for the student, is all part of this power of limitation that we're saying is present alongside and in tandem with the capacity for revelation. That a person has within, native to his capacity for intellect. So we'll hold it over here. I know that was a lot, and we're a little over on time, but it gives us a lot to think about, which is the whole analogy, right? Thanks everybody for coming.
You.